Welcome back. Joining us now is Jut Wynne, a conservation biologist and PhD candidate in biology who studies cave ecosystems all over the world. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So recently, you've made some really intriguing discoveries about Easter Island. Can you tell me about the environment on Easter Island and why the caves are so important?
Yes, certainly. Well, first off, what we know about Easter Island is from when the first Polynesian colonizers arrived to when the first European explorers visited the island, there was a major ecological shift that took place. Now, we know that the Polynesians arrived around 800 to 1200 AD, and the first Europeans arrived in 1722. Now, within this 500 to 900 year window, the environment changed from a subtropical palm-dominated woodland to a grassland. And with that, you can see that this is a dramatic shift. Something huge took place here. Now, the way in which animals often respond, they can respond in one of three ways. First, they go extinct. They cannot adapt to these changes and they go extinct. Secondly, they're able to adapt and they're able to make a living in their new environment. Thirdly, what often happens when we see these shifts or when there are major disturbances, there will be these pockets of undisturbed land where native plants are able to persist, and if the land is big enough, then we can also have vertebrate species, also invertebrate species. Now, turning our attention to the caves on Easter Island, what we have here is we have these protected environments that occurred within the entranceways of caves. We have what we're calling fern and moss gardens. Now, we know from the literature that the fern is an endemic or a native species which occurs there and nowhere else in the world, but it also is now restricted to caves only, so it occurs within these cave entranceways. And we also have 7 different species of moss that occur within the entranceways as well. 2 of these are endemic or native to the island. So when I first saw this environment, I thought immediately, well, my goodness, this is the place that we need to look. This is a good place to hunt for endemic arthropods. And sure enough, we were able to turn up 10 new species, 8 of which were endemic only to Easter Island, and then there were 2 which were endemic to Greater Polynesia.
So you stumbled upon this species because of your knowledge of the Colorado Plateau caves. How were you able to relate information from the desert Southwest to Easter Island?
That's a really good question. So I was working in El Malpais National Monument and I had a project there for several years, and I knew from working there that there were these moss gardens that occurred within the entranceways of those caves in west central New Mexico, which is southern Colorado Plateau. And I also knew from both my research and researchers that had done work there before me that there were these communities that occurred within these environments and nowhere else. They were relic communities. So when I walked into my very first cave in 2008 on Easter Island, I walked in there and I saw these fern and moss gardens and I said, boy, this is the place where we need to look. This is a really good environment, and I thought immediately back to my experience working in the Southwest.
So tell me a little bit more about what you and your team found on Easter Island.
So what we found is we found 10 new species. These are, they're all invertebrates. They're all very small. They're all soil or leaf litter dwelling animals. And as I mentioned earlier, 8 of which are occurring only on Easter Island. Another 2 occur within Greater Polynesia. The animals themselves, what we believe based on our research is that these animals are now restricted to the cave environment. And as I mentioned earlier, with that major ecological shift on the surface, these animals had nowhere else to go. And I'm not saying that these animals went into the cave and colonized the cave. They were most likely wide-ranging animals occurring throughout the island. And when the shift took place, they were just, they were kind of stuck where they were.
So why are these discoveries so important to Easter Island?
The reason why they're so important is, well, we know from our research on the island, there are 400 known arthropods or invertebrate species that occur on the island. Of those, at the time before we conducted this research, only 21 were endemic or native to the island only. Now, when we conducted our work, we were able to add an additional 10 to that number. So we now have 31 species that are endemic to the island. This island, as I mentioned, is highly invaded. It's been highly altered by human activity. And what has resulted here is that these 30 endemics are very important to the natural history of the island. For caves and the conservation of caves, and in a broader sense, the conservation of these animals on the island, is that caves alone represent the habitat of 1/3 of the known endemics, which makes caves very important for conservation, very important for the community, because this provides them with a sense of ownership of their natural history. And they've been in the textbooks for, several decades as being, this is what went wrong on Easter Island. And so they have an opportunity to rewrite the history books, if you will.
What does the future hold for these rare animals on Easter Island?
Oh gosh, the short answer, I have no idea. We do know that from our research, that the animals were detected in very low numbers. And because of that, I think that they're probably imperiled, and which means that they're going to be at risk of going extinct. And there are also two other factors that are wild card factors that we don't know how these animals are going to respond to, first of which is global climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a report in 2007, which suggested that the subtropical belt was going to experience greater droughts. We don't know how these animals are going to respond to those droughts. Secondly, there is the problem of invasive species, non-native invasive species. As I mentioned earlier, most of the species that we know of that occur on Rapa Nui, most of the arthropod species, are non-native. They've been introduced. And there are many mechanisms, in particular two, that are kind of driving the ship, if you will. The first of which is tourism. There are, 10+ flights a day coming in and out of Easter Island, and there are over 20,000 people annually that visit the island. So you can imagine all of the critters could be stowed away in their luggage that could be introduced. But perhaps a bigger issue is the fact that the island imports all of their goods from the mainland. And when you do that, and for example, you have a box of bananas. What's in the box of bananas? Well, there's obviously bananas, and there could be other critters with the bananas. So there's that other possible vector for non-native species introductions. So to sum up, we have non-native species introductions, we have global climate change, and we already have these animals occurring in very low numbers. So yes, it's an uncertain future, but I'm optimistic. I think that because these animals are so important, and because they are small animals, which means that you can start these captive breeding programs very easily, because you might just need a terrarium or something to do something like that. And this could be very beneficial to the animals, for one. As I mentioned, also it could be show a sense of ownership for the Rapa Nui people, because the community could get behind such an activity, and they have an opportunity to save the last remaining vestiges of the ancient ecosystem.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.